Today we're going to talk about physical evidence, also called indirect evidence, because you have to be able to find a link between the physical evidence and the crime scene or the suspect. So it's kind of an indirect way to get to matching a suspect to a crime. That's why it's called indirect. So physical evidence, again, is any object or material that's relevant in a crime. Okay, so it has to be something that's relevant to the crime. Examples: hair, fibers, and fingerprints. There's way more. This is the evidence that forensic scientists are interested in and work with. So previously we talked about testimonial evidence being eyewitness accounts. While those are important and can be valuable, the physical evidence is what forensic scientists focus on. Okay, and that can either refute testimonial evidence or it can support it. Physical evidence is generally much more reliable in court, and by reliable, what we mean is once you have physical evidence, it tends not to be wrong as often as testimonial evidence is. There's less cases that there's wrongful convictions in when physical evidence is there and it's matching and it's appropriate. So that's what we mean by generally more reliable. It's not necessarily always the one that juries lean towards the most. It should be, but it's not always. But it's generally more accurate than a testimonial piece of evidence is. So there are 5 different types of physical evidence, and we're going to go over all 5 in this video and talk about them. And then as we get into crime scenes, you'll be able to recognize them and be able to pull different pieces. It's always nice to get a variety of physical evidence if possible, just because they all kind of have unique things that make them valuable. So the first type of physical evidence is transient evidence. And this is evidence that's temporary, easily changed or lost, and it's oftentimes observed by the first officer on the scene. So the first officer on the crime scene that gets to the crime scene will oftentimes note any of the transient evidence. And here are some examples. You don't necessarily need to write all of them, but you may want to write some of them. Examples would be like odors, perfume, smoke, the smell of urine or burning. So anything that they would smell when they first walked in the scene of a crime. So say that they walked into an apartment where somebody had been murdered and they have a distinct smell of a specific cologne or perfume. That would be something worth noting. Someone had been there recently. Temperatures. The temperature of the surroundings of the crime scene, temperatures of things like water in a bathtub, or if they get to like an accident on this, like a freeway accident, they would take and feel like has the car been on recently? Is it, you know how cars feel warm on the hood when the engine's been running recently? Temperature in the bathwater, if somebody had drowned, was the water warm or cold? That would tell them, was it recent? Has the body been in there for a while, etc. Imprints, indentations, those are things that might go away quickly. So like if they were to get to a scene of a crime outdoors and it was raining or windy or something like that, and they noticed footprints, they would probably note those right away because those could potentially be easily lost with just nature. Okay, so transient evidence is any evidence that's temporary or easily changed or lost, and you would want to note that immediately. Take photos if you needed it, but most of the time it's usually just like notes that they take down of the transient evidence so that they don't lose that information later. The second type of physical evidence is pattern evidence. Pattern evidence is produced by direct contact between a person and an object or between 2 objects. That's the definition of pattern evidence. Most of it's in the form of indentations, imprints, striations, markings, fractures. So this is going to be like tire tracks on a road, blood spatter, right? That's between a person and an object. Projectile trajectories, bullets or cartridges that are in walls or on the floor in certain locations, tire marks, those types of things. A burn pattern, it's anything where there's a pattern that's made when there's contact between a person and an object or between 2 objects, like the tire in the ground or something like that. Conditional evidence. Conditional evidence is produced by a specific event or action. The conditional evidence that you want to jot down is going to be the stuff that's important in crime scene reconstruction and sequencing of events. It's going to let you know this happened before this may have occurred before this, so on and so forth. So here's some examples of conditional evidence. Lights. Like when you got to the scene of an accident, were the headlights on or off? When you got to the scene of a murder, were the lights on when you walked in the door? So on and so forth. The location of injuries or wounds. Like if you walked into the scene of a murder, somebody had been stabbed and there was a huge blood pool, say, on the sofa, but the body was on the floor. Well, that might suggest that the body had been moved at some point in time, right? So those are things that you would want to note down. The position of the body or wounds, like does it look like somebody had been flipped over or moved at some point in time? Was rigor set, right? Rigor, liver, algor mortis. Those are things that you would want to write down. And the scene of the crime, the condition of the furniture. Was there, was the back door open when you got there? Was there a window up? Was there signs of struggle? All of the conditional evidence is stuff that when they go to reconstruct it, the scene of the crime, they're going to want to note that and put that information in the reconstruction. So conditional evidence is stuff you'll either jot down or take photos of, but it's stuff that you want to do because a specific event or something had caused it, and it would be important in the reconstruction. The fourth type of evidence is what we call transfer evidence. Transfer evidence is produced contact between a person and an object, or persons and persons. Think like somebody is running out of a house and they smear blood from their hand that's bleeding onto the door. Or a fingerprint would be an example of transfer evidence, right? You touch something, your fingerprints get left behind. Or between two people. A hair fiber transfers from my shirt onto somebody that I've hugged or something like that. That would be examples of transfer evidence. And then the last one is what we call associative evidence. And associative evidence is something that might associate the victim or the suspect with the crime scene or each other. A lot of times this is not common evidence to find, but when you do, it's kind of like your lucky day. It's like, hey, this person left their driver's license at the scene of the crime. Their wallet fell out when they were fleeing the scene. Or they wrote a nasty email that their name was signed on to the suspect before something happened. Or a bank card was left at a robbery, or different things like that. It's something that will associate the victim or suspect with the crime scene or each other. That's like a very distinct thing. Okay, it's usually some type of personal belongings that can associate directly to that individual. It's not super common to find associative evidence, but it does happen, and when it does, it's super nice to have. Okay, so those are the 5 different types of physical evidence, and sometimes there's evidence that can fall into more than one category. Like, for example, shoe prints could fall into transfer evidence and pattern evidence, right? So sometimes they can kind of jump into more than one category depending. Sometimes they could be considered transient depending on the conditions of the crime scene. And that's okay. Okay, they don't have to just fit into one specific mold. But all 5 of these are different types of evidence that you could find at a crime scene at any given point in time. So now that we know the different types of physical evidence that can be found, what's the purpose of it? What do we do with it? The next thing is for forensic investigations, okay? You do a couple different things with evidence. The first thing that you want to do is you want to identify it. It's the identification of it. You can use physical, chemical, morphological, biological, immunological properties. So any way that you can. You find something at a crime scene, like say that you find hairs and you want to identify, is it human, is it animal, so on and so forth. You could use microscopes, you could use lab procedures, whatever it is. So the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to identify what the actual evidence is. And then you're going to do what's called a comparison. This is going to be where you compare the evidence to a control of some type. And you should definitely write this down. What a control is. Okay? A control is a substance that the origin is known. okay? The control is a substance where the origin is known. So for example, say that they find a cup left over at a crime scene and they swab it for DNA. They take it back to the lab. They identify that there is a DNA profile on the swab. Well, that doesn't do us any good unless we have a DNA profile to compare it from. So maybe we take the victim's DNA that was at the crime scene and we run their DNA profile against the one we found to see if there's a match, right? So a control sample would be the victim's DNA. We would take say that it was somebody who had been killed. We would take their DNA from them, and that would be our control sample, and we would compare it to our unknown at our crime scene. If it matched, we would know that it was the victim's. If it didn't match, we would know maybe that it's our suspect, right? So you would compare the DNA found at the crime scene. The DNA at the crime scene is your unknown. That's what you're trying to figure out, who it matches, to a control. The control can be your victim. If you had a suspect arrested, you could get a warrant and take a DNA sample from them. That would also be a control. So a control is just any sample that you have that you know where you got it from. The unknown is usually always at your crime scene because that's what you're trying to find out what it matches. Okay, so you're going to do comparisons, and then you'll do what's called individualization. You'll show that the evidence sample is unique among other members of the same class. So we'll talk more about this coming up, but basically you want to make sure, is your DNA sample 100% matched? It can't match anything else, which DNA is. And then the last thing you do is you do a reconstruction of events that take place. Okay, so then once you kind of go through the process of identifying, comparing, and individualizing all the different evidence, and then finding out what happened, you do kind of a reconstruction of everything that occurred. Okay, so that's kind of the process of a forensic investigation. So here's the value or the reason that physical evidence is important. It can prove that a crime has been committed. It's probative, right? So we can use physical evidence to prove that a crime was committed. So it's probative. It can corroborate or refute testimony. So if you have an eyewitness account of what happened, the physical evidence can either say, yes, the physical evidence is agreeing with exactly what the eyewitness said. Everything that we have for physical evidence matches what the eyewitness said, or it can refute it. No, what the eyewitness is saying is not matching our physical evidence. It can link a suspect with the victim or the crime scene. So we can use it to help link a suspect to a crime scene or to a victim. It can help establish the identity of persons associated with crimes. You find a fingerprint, an unknown fingerprint, we run it through IAFIS, it pulls up a suspect, that type of thing. And it can allow for the reconstruction of events at a crime scene. So there's tons and tons of value for physical evidence. It's huge, super, super important. Pretty much the whole job of a forensic scientist is based on physical evidence.